Marcus Whitfield thought his marriage was over. He didn't know that in 11 minutes, a single overheard conversation would rewrite everything he believed about the woman he'd been married to for 19 years. He didn't know that the story he'd assembled in his mind, piece by careful piece, was built on a foundation that had never existed. And by the time he understood what she'd been carrying alone, in silence, in the dark, he would be ashamed he ever reached for that suitcase. If stories about second chances and the things we get wrong about the people closest to us mean something to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments where you're watching. From tonight, I genuinely want to know who's out there with me, sharing this quiet hour. Now, let me take you into that house on Maple Crest Drive on the coldest evening of the year, when a man packed a bag and nearly threw away the best thing he'd ever built. The suitcase was open on the bed. Marcus had folded 7 shirts, and each fold felt like a small verdict handed down. He smoothed the collars flat by habit, the way he smoothed the corners of blueprints, and he tried not to notice that his hands were not quite steady. He was 46 years old, a structural engineer who had spent his entire life making certain that things which looked solid actually were that. A beam could hold what the drawings promised, that a bridge would not betray the people who crossed it. And now, on this January night, he could no longer tell whether his own marriage was one of those things, sound beneath the surface or hollow, waiting to fail the moment any real weight came down on it. The house was quiet, in the way that only a failing house can be quiet, not peaceful, braced. Like a beam holding a load it was never designed for, groaning somewhere below the range of hearing. The furnace ticked. The wind pressed against the windows, and in every room there was the particular silence of 2 people who had stopped reaching for each other so long ago that the reaching itself had begun to feel like a foreign language. He and Diane had stopped talking somewhere in the last 2 years, not fighting. That was the thing that had frightened him most. Fighting would have been warmth. Fighting would have meant there was still something worth defending. Instead, they had simply become 2 people who passed each other in hallways, who ate at the same table without meeting each other's eyes, who said good night out of habit the way you might lock a door out of habit, without ever checking whether anyone was still inside. She worked late. She left the house on Tuesday and Thursday evenings without explanation, and she came home with red eyes she pretended were from the wind. She had grown thin so gradually that he'd only truly seen it when an old photograph slipped out of a drawer and stopped him cold. She had grown far away. And she had grown quiet in a way that Marcus, in his fear, had mistaken for indifference. And Marcus, being a man who trusted evidence above all things, had built a theory from the pieces. He was good at that. It was his profession, to take fragments and stresses and measurements and assemble from them a picture of what was really happening inside a structure. So, he had gathered the evidence of his marriage the same way. The late nights, the secretive phone calls she took in the garage with the door pulled shut behind her, the way she actually flinched when he asked where she'd been, the new distance in her eyes, as though she were already somewhere he could not follow. A man his age knew what those things usually meant. Everyone knew. And the knowing had curdled inside him for months, souring a little more each week until he could no longer breathe under the weight of it. He had decided tonight he would tell her he was leaving. He would be dignified about it. That mattered to him more than it should have. He would not shout. He would not accuse. He would simply state the truth as he understood it and walk out into the cold and begin whatever came after, alone, the way he had felt alone for 2 years. Already inside these walls, he zipped the first pocket of the suitcase, closed. The sound was small and final, a zipper's teeth closing like a decision. It was then that he heard the car in the driveway, not Diane's sedan, though that was there too. A second vehicle behind it, its headlights sweeping across the bedroom ceiling. He crossed to the window and looked down through the frost-flowered glass, his breath fogging the pane. Diane was climbing out of her car, moving carefully, one hand braced on the door. And behind her, stepping from an old gray Buick with a rattle in its engine, was Pastor Elias Grant from Cornerstone Fellowship, the church Diane had started attending alone 8 months ago. He'd told himself he was too busy, that Sunday mornings were for catching up on the Harborview drawings, for the sleep he never got during the week. But the truth, the real truth, he rarely let himself look at directly, was that he'd been too proud and too certain that whatever she was looking for in that building, it was a search that had already left him behind. He had let her walk into that church alone every week, and he had called it giving her space. He understood now, watching the two figures below, that he had never once asked her what she was carrying in there. He watched the two of them walk toward the front door, heads bent together against the wind, the pastor's hand hovering near her elbow, as though ready to catch her. He heard the door open below, felt the cold draft climb the stairs. He heard the low murmur of voices moving into the kitchen, the scuff of coats being hung, and Marcus, who had already decided to leave, who had a suitcase half-packed on the bed and a speech half-rehearsed in his mouth, found himself doing something he was not proud of, something small and furtive that would have shamed him on any other night. He moved to the top of the stairs, and he listened. The heating vent in the upstairs hallway carried sound from the kitchen the way a seashell carries the ocean. He had learned that years ago, when the kids were small, when he could crouch beside it and hear them whispering conspiracies long after bedtime and smile to himself in the dark. He crouched beside it now, a grown man on his knees on the cold hardwood, and he listened to his wife's voice float up through the metal, thin and warped, but unmistakably hers. "Thank you for coming, Pastor," Diane was saying. "I couldn't have asked him to come to the church. He doesn't know I go. He doesn't know any of it. You've carried this a long time, Diane," the pastor said. His voice was gentle, worn, smooth like a stone in a riverbed, the kind of voice that had sat with 100 people on the worst nights of their lives, longer than most people could have, longer than you should have had to. There was the sound of a chair pulling out, the scrape of its legs against the tile, then the clink of a kettle being set on the stove, and the click of the burner. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool edge of the vent and waited, and the waiting felt exactly like the moment before. A beam takes the full weight, and you finally learn whether your math was right or whether everything is about to come down. "I don't even know how to say it out loud anymore," Diane said. "I've said it to God so many times, in that car, in parking lots, in the middle of the night. But saying it to a person feels different, like it becomes real again, like it can still reach out and touch me." "Take your time," the pastor said. "There's no clock in here tonight." And then his wife began to speak, slowly at first, then faster, the words tumbling out as though a door had finally given way. And Marcus Whitfield's entire understanding of the last 2 years came apart in his hands like wet paper. "20 months ago," Diane said, "I found a lump right side. I remember exactly where I was standing when my fingers found it. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself it was nothing, the way everyone tells themselves it's nothing, because the alternative is unthinkable. Then the doctor called, and it wasn't nothing." She drew a breath that he could hear even through the vent, a shaking, careful, deliberate breath, the breath of someone bracing to lift something heavy. Stage 2. They caught it, thank God, but only just. Another few months, and it might have been a different conversation. Entirely. And I made a decision, standing in that examination room, with the phone still warm against my ear, a decision I've regretted and been grateful for. At the very same time, every single day since, I decided not to tell Marcus. Marcus stopped breathing, his hand found the wall beside the vent and pressed flat against it as though the house had tilted. "He was in the middle of the Harborview project," she went on. "That bridge, you have to understand what it meant to him, Pastor. It was everything. 10 years of his career, all of it leading up to that one commission, his name on something that would still be standing when our grandchildren were old. And there had already been the cutbacks at his firm, the layoffs, that partner who left him holding all the blame for a delay that was never his fault. He came home, gray in the face some nights. He was barely sleeping as it was. And I thought, if I tell him now, he'll drop everything. I know that man. He'll walk away from the one thing that's kept him standing upright these last few years. He'll sit in waiting rooms with me for hours and watch the project collapse and lose himself entirely. And then I'll have taken his health and his life's work both in one blow. I couldn't do that to him. I couldn't be the reason he lost everything he'd built. So you went through the treatment alone, the pastor said softly. It was not a question. It was the gentle laying down of an unbearable fact. Tuesdays and Thursdays, Diane said. Chemotherapy first, then radiation after. That's where I go. That's the secret. Beth from the church, she'd drive me some of the days, sit with me in that cold room while the medicine went in, hold my hand and talk to me about her garden, so I'd have something ordinary to hold on to. And other times, I'd drive myself and sit in the parking lot for an hour afterward before I felt steady enough to come home and pretend. I'd wash my face in the gas station bathroom on Route 9 so he wouldn't see I'd been crying, so the redness would settle before I walked through our door. I lost weight, and I told him it was stress from work. I lost my hair, and her voice cracked clean in half, a sound like something breaking under load. I bought a wig that matched, spent an afternoon at a shop finding the exact shade so he wouldn't notice. I do my makeup differently now, brighter, so the color in my face looks real, so I don't look like what I am. Do you know what it is, Pastor, to hide something like that from the person who sleeps beside you every night? To lie to him every single day, not because you don't love him, but because you love him too much to make him watch you break upstairs. Marcus Whitfield had both hands pressed hard over his mouth to keep from making a sound. Behind him, on the bed, sat the suitcase, the 7 folded shirts, the rehearsed and dignified speech he had polished for weeks. Every certainty he had built had been resting on nothing. He had looked at the evidence, all of it, and he had read it perfectly, catastrophically wrong. The secret phone calls in the garage were with her oncologist, with the scheduling office, with the lab. The garage was simply where she took the news. She could not bear to hear inside the house where he might see her face. The red eyes were not another man. They had never been another man. The red eyes were the mark of a war for her own life, a war she had chosen to wage in absolute silence so that he would not have to lay down his own. And now, the pastor asked gently, the last scan. You told me on the phone there was news. There was a long pause. In that pause, in the space of a held breath, Marcus lived and died 100 separate times. Clear, Diane whispered, and the word broke apart even as she said it. 2 weeks ago, they told me it's gone. No evidence of disease. That's the phrase they use. So careful, like they don't want to jinx it. I sat in that parking lot for 2 hours afterward, and I cried until I couldn't cry anymore. And do you know, the very first coherent thought I had, Pastor? The very first one? She laughed, a wet and broken sound that was worse than weeping. I thought, now I have to tell him. Now the war is finally over, and I have to go home and tell my husband that I fought the whole thing without him, that I did the entire terrifying thing alone, in the dark, 6 feet away from him. And I'm terrified, because I think I've lost him anyway. I've watched him pull away from me all this year, watched the distance grow between us at the dinner table, and I know exactly why. I've been a ghost in my own house. I've been distant and secretive and cold because I had nothing left to give him. Every last ounce of me went into surviving, into getting up and going to work and coming home and pretending, and there was simply nothing left over for us, for tenderness, for the small warm things that hold a marriage together. And he doesn't know that. He can't know that. He just knows that I disappeared from him. I think he believes I've stopped loving him. And how do I ever explain to him that the reason I couldn't love him the way he needed this year is that I was trying so hard, with everything I had, not to leave him a widower." The kettle began to whistle downstairs, a rising shriek. Nobody moved to take it off. It screamed into the silence for a long moment, and then Marcus heard the pastor's chair scrape, and the whistle strangle and die as someone lifted it from the flame, and when the man spoke again, his voice was thick and unsteady. "Diane, that man upstairs, does he know how deeply he is loved? Does he have any idea, any at all, what you sacrificed to protect him this year?" "No," she said, "and that's the thing I'm most ashamed of. Not the cancer, the choosing. I made all of these choices for him without ever once asking him. I decided he couldn't handle it. I decided that I knew better, that I carry it for both of us. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe it was the most wrong thing I've ever done. Maybe I stole from him the chance to be there for me, the chance to be my husband when it mattered most, because I was too proud to be weak in front of him. My mother used to say I'd rather carry a mountain alone than let a single soul see me set it down and rest. She said it like a warning, and I think I've almost lost my whole marriage proving her right." On the stairs, Marcus was weeping without sound, the tears running hot and silent over the hands still pressed to his face. He thought of every cold moment of the last 2 years and watched each one flip inside out before him. Watch the terror that had been hiding behind every silence. Watch the truth reassemble itself into a picture so different from the one he'd built that he barely recognized his own life. While he had been quietly, methodically building a case for her betrayal, gathering evidence like a prosecutor, she had been quietly, secretly, unbearably fighting to stay alive so that he would not be left alone in the world. He thought of the suitcase. He thought of how close he had come. Minutes, only minutes, to walking down those stairs and delivering his cold, dignified, devastating speech to a woman who had just beaten cancer alone in the dark to spare him a single day of suffering. The shame of it was a physical thing, a fist closing hard around his ribs, squeezing until he could barely draw breath. "You need to tell him," the pastor said, "all of it. Tonight, if you can find the strength. Not because you owe him an explanation. You don't owe anyone your suffering, but because he deserves to know the truth of who he's married to. A man who's been loved like that, protected like that, at such a cost. He should get to know it. He should get to carry it too now, and I think he's stronger than you've given him credit for. Diane, I've listened to you describe him for 8 months. I think you'll find that. I'm scared he'll be angry that I hid it," she said, very quietly, "that I lied to him for 20 months. He hates being lied to more than almost anything. He might be at first. Truth like this doesn't land soft. It can't. But under the anger, if he's the man you've described to me, the man who builds things meant to last 100 years, there will be something else waiting beneath it. Give him the chance to show you what it is. You've spent 20 months deciding what he can bear. Let him decide for himself now." Marcus heard his wife begin to cry in earnest then, and it was that sound, not the diagnosis, not the treatment, not even the word cancer, that had struck him like a hammer against a bell. It was the sound of Diane crying in their own kitchen with a near stranger because she had been too afraid to cry in front of him, her husband of 19 years. That was the sound that finally got him to his feet. He did not think about what he would say. For the first time in 2 years, he did not plan a speech, did not rehearse or measure or prepare. He simply walked down the stairs, and the third step creaked the way it always had, the sound it had made for 19 years, and the voices in the kitchen fell instantly, utterly silent. Diane appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Marcus saw her clearly for the first time in a very long while. He saw the wig he had never once noticed, the careful part of it. He saw the makeup laid gently over a face that had grown thin and pale beneath it. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fragility in her shoulders, the shape of everything she had hidden in plain sight. He saw the woman who had been fighting a war 6 feet away from him while he slept soundly beside her. And he saw the exact moment she understood, reading the ruin of his own tear-streaked face that he had heard every word. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Marcus," she breathed. "Marcus, how long have you?" He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and he took her in his arms before she could finish, before she could brace herself, and he held her. The way you hold something you almost lost, the way you hold something you never knew was in danger until it was very nearly gone forever. She was rigid against him for a second, her whole body braced for the anger, for the accusation, for the fallout of the secret finally breaking open. And then she felt him shaking. She felt the tears soaking hot into her shoulder, felt the way his arms trembled around her, and she understood, slowly, disbelievingly, that the thing she had feared for 20 months, that the truth would shatter them beyond repair, was not going to happen at all. "You should have told me," he said into her hair, and his voice was wrecked past recognition. "God, Diane, you should have told me. I would have been there. I would have been there for every second of it." "I couldn't," she wept, clutching the front of his shirt. "I couldn't watch you lose everything you'd worked for." "You," he said, pulling back just far enough to take her face in both his hands, cradling it like something breakable. "You are everything. Do you hear me? Do you understand what I'm telling you? The bridge, the firm, the career, all of it. Diane, none of it matters. None of it. You could have burned every drawing I ever made. You could have let the whole project fall into the river, and I would have knelt down in the ashes with you and been grateful just to be there. That is what a husband is for. That is the entire point of me. Everything else is just steel." He pressed his forehead to hers, and their tears ran together. "I thought you'd stopped loving me," he confessed, the words raw and terrible. "I built a whole story out of it. I had a suitcase packed upstairs. Diane, right now on our bed. I was going to leave you tonight. I had it all planned. I had the words ready. That's the man I almost was tonight. And in my mind, you were some kind of betrayer, some kind of stranger. And the whole time, you were down here, dying to protect me, fighting for your life, so I'd never have to grieve you." She let out a sound that was half sob and half broken laugh. "Not dying," she whispered fiercely. "Living. They said, it's gone. I'm still here. I heard," he said, his thumbs wiping at her tears. "I heard all of it, every word. I heard the whole thing." He looked past her shoulder to where Pastor Elias Grant stood by the window with tears standing bright on his own weathered face, quietly giving them the room, one hand resting on the back of a chair. "Thank you," Marcus said to him, his voice breaking, "for being here when I wasn't, for being what I should have been all this year." The pastor shook his head slowly, gently. "You're here now, son. That's the only tense that matters. Now is where a life gets built." Marcus turned back to his wife, holding both her hands now between them. He thought about the 2 years he had misread so completely, the evidence he had gathered and assembled into entirely the wrong picture, the pride that had kept him out of that church and out of her confidence and out of the truth. And he thought about how a man could be so precise in his work, could calculate every load and stress and tolerance to the 1,000th of an inch, and still fail utterly to see the one thing bending and breaking right in front of him, because he had been so certain, so arrogantly certain, that he already understood it. "I don't ever want to be a stranger in this house again," he said, and he meant it like a vow. "Whatever comes next, the follow-ups, the scans, the years of watching and waiting, I'm in every single waiting room. I'm holding your hand at every appointment. I'm learning the nurses' names. You never carry a mountain alone in this marriage again, not one more day. That's over. That ends tonight, right here, in this kitchen." "And the suitcase?" she asked, and there was something fragile and impossibly hopeful in the way she said it. "I'm going to go upstairs and unpack it," he said slowly. "Every shirt. And then I'm going to come back down here and sit at this table with you and this good man, and I'm going to hear the whole thing from the very beginning. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, every parking lot, everything you went through, because I never again want there to be a single chapter of your life that I wasn't allowed to be part of." And so they sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning. The three of them. The kettle boiled and reboiled until the whistle became familiar, and Diane told all of it, the fear in the doctor's office when the phone rang, the first infusion, the cold that spread through her veins, the metal taste of it. The nights she lay awake listening to him breathe in the dark beside her and swore to herself silently that she would beat this thing so completely that he would never have to know how close it had come to taking her. And Marcus listened to every word without once looking away, and he held her hand across the table the entire time, his grip never loosening, and something that had been quietly broken in that house for 2 long years began, slowly, carefully, to be made whole again. In the weeks that followed, Marcus went with her to every appointment, without exception. He rearranged his entire life around the calendar of her care. He sat in the waiting rooms he had never known existed, waiting rooms she had sat in alone 100 times, and he learned the names of the nurses who had held her steady when he did not know she was falling. He started going to Cornerstone Fellowship on Sunday mornings, sitting beside her in the pew with the drawings left at home, and he was surprised, humbled, truly humbled, to find in that building not the rival he had imagined, but a community of ordinary people who had quietly held his wife up when he had no idea she was sinking. He learned that Beth, the woman who had driven her to chemotherapy through snow and rain, had been praying faithfully for a marriage she had never even seen because Diane had asked her to. He learned how many strangers had loved him on his wife's behalf, without his ever knowing a single one of their names, without his ever thanking them. He never finished the Harborview Bridge the way he had once planned to, obsessively, feverishly, at the cost of everything else in his life. He finished it well, and he finished it on time. And then he went home at 6 o'clock every evening, because he had finally learned the true measurement of a life, and it was not counted in spans of steel or in the years a structure could stand. It was counted in the ordinary evenings you were present for. A year later, on the anniversary of the scan that came back clear, Marcus and Diane stood together at the front of Cornerstone Fellowship and renewed their vows. Not because the old ones had failed them, but because both of them finally, truly understood what those words had always meant, in sickness and in health. He had said them 19 years earlier without ever imagining they would be tested in secret, in silence, in the dark. She had lived them out entirely alone. And now they would live the rest of them together, in the light, with nothing hidden between them ever again. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I want you to sit with it too, wherever you are tonight. Marcus Whitfield was a man who trusted evidence above all things, and the evidence lied to him, not because it was false, but because he read it through the lens of his own fear. He saw distance, and he called it betrayal. He saw silence, and he called it the end. And how often do we do exactly the same thing with the people we love the most? How often do we build an entire story out of someone's behavior, brick by brick, and never once stop to ask what pain might be hiding underneath it? Diane's mistake was believing that love meant carrying the mountain alone. Marcus's mistake was believing the worst before he ever asked for the truth. And they almost lost 19 years to those two mistakes over a heating vent in the cold in the space of 11 minutes. Sometimes the person who seems to be pulling away from you is not leaving you at all. Sometimes they are protecting you from a weight they don't believe you can bear. And the bravest thing you can ever do is not to pack a suitcase and walk out into the cold, but to walk down the stairs and listen and ask. So let me ask you, wherever you're watching from tonight, have you ever misjudged someone you loved, only to discover that the truth was the very opposite of what you feared? Have you ever come close to walking away from something that was worth staying for? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read them. Every one, and I know that others will find real comfort in them too. If this story touched something in you, please like this video and subscribe, because I have more stories like this one coming, stories about the second chances we so nearly throw away. and the love that turns out to be stronger than our worst assumptions. Stay a little longer with the people you love tonight. Ask the question. You never know what they've been carrying alone.